All right, take it away, John.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the first systems facing track call of 2021. Hope everyone had a happy New Year's and everyone and their family is staying safe through this pandemic. First, I'd like to start off by announcing the new systems facing track committee members. Just in case you want to shoot us an email or shoot us an idea about a talk or a call topic that you would like to see either discussed, or if you have an idea and would like to present your talk to the systems facing track community. First on the list is Cy Penpally from Louisiana State University, Jim Leos from Penn State, Betsy Hillary, of course, from Purdue University, Jason Wells from Bentley University, and then, of course, you all know Troy Baer from OSC, and Brian Haymore of University of Utah. And then I have also joined them as well. So during this discussion, because of the heated emotions that may arise from CentOS 8 becoming a thing of the past and Red Hat moving towards CentOS 8 Stream, I'm gonna have to remind everyone to be civil. I don't think we'll have to slap anyone's hands, but just in case, please be civil. Don't call anyone names or anything like that. So with that reminder, I'm sorry, Mike, what, Michael? Okay. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel members for today's topic. We should have Ruben Lara from PACE at Georgia Tech, Troy Baer from Ohio Supercomputing Center, Adam DeConinck from NVIDIA, and Karl Schulz from University of Texas, and also the OpenHPC project lead. So panel members, welcome. So to start off our discussion, I'd like for panel members to tell us a little bit about your respective sites, how large the systems are that your site manages, and what OS you currently run on those machines. So Troy, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I'm Troy Baer from OSC. OSC systems, we currently have 2, Pitzer and Owens. Those are both 600 to 800 node clusters. Those are running an NFS root RHEL system. However, in a previous life, I worked for the University of Tennessee and at NICS, the National Institute for Computational Sciences, we had some Cray and SGI systems that ran SLES. So I've had some experience running in a mixed environment where we had some RHEL systems and some SLES systems, and how to handle managing both at the same time.
All right, thank you. Adam.
Hi, my name is Adam DeConinck. I work at NVIDIA, where I'm a solutions architect, and I also help on a variety of our internal test systems and HPC systems. Probably the best known cluster that we have is Selene, which is a 560 node DGX A100 cluster, which currently runs a stack based on Ubuntu 2004. We also have a variety of smaller clusters, normally probably in like the 16 to 64 node range, depending on what they're being used for. And there are a number of those also run Ubuntu, but we also have a couple of those that run CentOS or RHEL. And so we also have a fair amount of experience trying to run workloads and manage systems on both of those stacks.
All right, thanks, Adam. Karl Schulz.
Hi, everybody. It's Karl Schulz. So I'm going to be kind of wearing my OpenHPC hat today. I think a number of folks have heard a little bit about that. So, we're kind of more in the business of supporting academic users and not just academic users, but all HPC users around the world. So it's a bit hard for me to say exactly how many systems there are. But just to say a little bit, we do builds against 2 operating systems. We have for about the last 4 years, and that has included some sort of SUSE variant and always has been CentOS since the very beginning. By far, I would say that the vast majority of the users of OpenHPC packaging is CentOS based, somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 98%. Not unsurprisingly, you might, it would be not unsurprising to hear that most recently we've seen a bit of an uptake in our other operating system that's not CentOS, I think just based on the news, but we have been dominated by CentOS since the very beginning, which I think represents the HPC community at large. We have small systems, big systems, upwards of biggest systems are probably in the sort of 4,000 node range. Lots of small systems, maybe people on the call are using bits and pieces of OpenHPC. We have something like, I don't know, about 10,000 IPs hit our package repository a month. We had about 86 terabytes of packages downloaded last year, and we just put out a release for CentOS 8 at the end of the year, and we saw a big uptake in that. So like everybody else here, the news sort of caught us off guard. And so we are also tracking this like everybody else, but certainly to try to make an educated decision as to how to move forward. So thanks.
Right, thanks, Karl. So, we have a wide variety of operating systems that are used at different sites. But, CentOS hasn't been around forever. It was, really only a thing since, Red Hat 2 came on the market and started to appear as a downstream repackaging of RHEL. So I'd like to ask, what OS has people first deployed when they started getting into operating HPC systems or supercomputers? Again, we'll start with Troy.
I've been doing primarily Red Hat for almost my entire career, and that goes back to, I think, 1999 is when we started doing HPC clusters at OSC. It was actually a little bit of a sea change when I got to NICS and found out that, oh, these are SLES machines, and it's a weird bespoke way of managing SLES from that's from Cray. But yeah, most of my career has been Red Hat.
All right, how about you, Adam?
I would say most of my career has probably been Red Hat as well. It's definitely where I got started. Like Troy, I also had some experience at a past job with SLES on Cray, which was definitely its own thing. And then Ubuntu has really, for me anyway, dominated a lot of my attention recently, especially given that, that's the stack that we primarily run on the NVIDIA DGX, and also a number of our data science, like the data science customers I work with are often very comfortable with Ubuntu, and so we'll help them run with that as well.
All right, how about you, Karl?
Yeah, I definitely also started in the Red Hat ecosystem. Maybe about the same time frame as Troy, started with Red Hat with a 16-node cluster in my garage, BDing disks to each other to build it. And then some folks may know I was at TAC for a large number of years, for about a decade. And there we were entirely a CentOS shop until getting some craze, but for the most part, entirely a CentOS shop. On the OpenHPC side, our first release was with CentOS 7. We shortly thereafter did a release against SLES. I spent some time at Intel where they had some interest in doing SLES. So I've sort of now bounced back and forth, say for about the last 6 or 7 years between Red Hat and SLES, and now in OpenHPC land, we use Leap, which is interesting, for folks if you haven't followed things on the SLES side. The SLES folks released OpenSUSE Leap, which is sort of more like what we're used to with CentOS with respect to RHEL. Now, it's not just a rebuild, but what they advertise is that it's binary compatible with SLES. So with OpenHPC 2.0, we started to do builds against Leap because it was just completely 100% open source and available, and we think that's the right thing for our community. But I bounce back and forth between those. And to be honest, since they're both RPM based, I mean, I think the big difference going from one distro to another from an administration point of view is around packaging. And at least between, OpenSUSE and Red Hat, it's all RPMs at the end of the day. It's a different package manager in front of it, but it's all RPMs. So I find it pretty easy to go back and forth. Once you go to a Debian based one, I think that's where people see a bit more difference. But obviously, as was mentioned, we see a lot more use of that in the data space world. So I do a little bit on the Ubuntu as well, but for the most part, it's actually in that case almost always through containers. But on bare metal, it's pretty much SLES and Red Hat based systems today.
Right. Thanks, Karl. And you bring up a good point about the compatibility of RPMs between CentOS and other RHEL variants and SUSE. Since they do, loosely conform to the LSB or Linux standard base. So with that, what are people looking as far as different options for CentOS 8? Now that CentOS 8 Stream is going to be the new future come 2021, and ostensibly in 2024 after CentOS 7 support runs out. Troy?
Well, we have a Red Hat site license, so I think, at least for the foreseeable future, probably going to stick with that. We haven't historically used CentOS except for one-off things where it was non-production.
And how about you, Adam? Is the plan to stick with Ubuntu for NVIDIA?
So I think we're definitely going to be sticking with Ubuntu in a lot of cases. We definitely still run a bunch of CentOS and Red Hat internally in other places, especially like one cluster that I can think of in particular that we use a lot with NVIDIA partners and customers. That's a CentOS-based cluster today because it's a system that we tend to use to help people, help people we work with duplicate issues or solve problems. I think that probably we're going to end up in a very mixed environment where in some cases we're going to license Red Hat directly so that we can stay on the same stack. And probably those will be smaller environments. We may look at CentOS Stream and see, we will probably at least spend some time on CentOS Stream and see whether that fits our needs in other places. But I think it's going to be a very case-by-case basis. Thanks.
Karl, what are the plans for OpenHPC?
Well, that's a bit to be determined, and in some sense why I was hoping to participate in today's call and hopefully get some feedback from folks as well. Because CentOS has been our dominant operating system used in OpenHPC, we know that everybody's trying to figure out what they're going to use as a replacement. We also have some early experience with Stream, basically because once CentOS 8 came out, it was certainly possible that you could enable Stream. And I think our initial take, and at least it seems like this is somewhat common talking through folks in the HPC world, is that Stream is likely just to move too fast for people's liking. And we've experienced this on the OpenHPC side with users who enabled Stream and it broke things when they tried to upgrade. So for example, HWLoc, in Stream, they're willing to change APIs and .SOs very quickly. And that could happen on a day-by-day basis, right? And I think fundamentally that's something to sort of keep in mind from what we're used to on the HPC side. And for better or for worse, we're used to sort of doing updates at relatively slow periods compared to perhaps the IT world, right? We're used to CentOS 8.1 and 8.2 and 8.3 maybe coming out at the 6-month interval or something like that. And we will certainly patch important things like security related stuff, but we're usually not touching everything every day on our systems, just because we're usually all building huge amounts of software on top of the base operating system. So I think Stream is going to be difficult, perhaps, unless the Red Hat folks change their mind in terms of, limiting how much they're going to change. But that's not what they've advertised thus far. So I think that, it's still too early to tell, but I think Stream is probably not a likely option for us. So then the question is, what do we choose as a replacement? So what we're just sort of tracking the developments. We're aware of, a number of sort of replacements for CentOS. Some have been mentioned on the chat. Rocky Linux certainly seems to have a lot of momentum behind it. Greg Kurtzer, who was involved in the original CentOS project, was also part of OpenHPC when we started. He was on our technical steering committee, and we're certainly following that. And it seems like they're promising to have a release by first quarter that should just be enable a new release package, and in theory you should be able to move forward. So I don't know what's going to be the version of a future CentOS that everybody moves to, but I do think there's going to be at least one option. I think the hard part is to know, well, what's its long-term lifespan, right? And that's kind of what we're all worried about. But my assumption is that OpenHPC will pivot and do builds against one of these new versions, probably not against Red Hat, just because I don't think that's what the majority of our community wants, although it would be ideal if the builds that we do are 100% binary compatible with RHEL-based systems. For those who do have site license, of course, then they don't care about it too much. But we'll go forward with Leap, and maybe there'll be some more uptake in that, but we'll be looking, say, in the next 2 quarters to figure out what our replacement for CentOS will be.
Yeah, I hear you mention Rocky Linux, which is, of course, the big effort, it seems, in the community, and hopefully, something that ends up paying off and actually coming to fruition sometime hopefully this year. But there are a few other options out there as well that are downstream rebuilds of RHEL, such as Springdale Linux, Oracle Linux. If you wanted to hop on another vendor supplied bandwagon for an OS, Project Linux, and of course, OpenSUSE Leap or Tumbleweed if you really want to ride the bleeding edge. And then I have heard of a few sites that have in the past run Gentoo as well. But a lot of the criticism coming towards Red Hat and CentOS is that, we may not have, there may be binary compatibility, but, a lot of, the extra bits that HPC sites commonly need, such as, kernel modules for parallel file systems, or even, custom kernel modules for, hardware accelerators, or even high-speed interconnect cards, could be a problem going forward. And it's hard to know, especially with Stream, which packages you should be matching up with, or whether, vendors will even supply kernel modules and packages targeted towards CentOS Stream. Are there any thoughts as far as from NVIDIA as far as supporting CentOS Stream and how difficult that may be?
I'm not plugged in directly to that effort. I know that that's being looked at, but I don't have anything I can say about it today, in part because I think it's still like actively in the works and being discussed.
All right. So I guess another question would be, is anyone putting forward any effort towards Rocky Linux at this point, or is everyone just cautiously observing from the outset? Troy?
I think right now we're just playing a wait and see attitude. Like I said, we mainly use RHEL anyway, so it's more a matter of academic curiosity for us.
How about you, Adam? Is there any effort internally to contribute to Rocky Linux or any of the other alternatives?
Nothing that I'm aware of right now. I definitely think that falls into the actively being discussed category, but also this is all still relatively new enough that I don't think anyone has managed to launch an effort in any of those directions yet.
And Karl, any efforts that you know of at University of Texas?
No, I just echo the previous sentiments, I think, and there's a comment on chat. I mean, I think there is no Rocky Linux just yet, right? So there's nothing to test against. There is, though, and I mean, I'm on their, well, I was on their Slack. They just switched to use some different chat business, but I mean, there's a huge number of people. They've selected a build infrastructure. They do seem to be heading in the right direction. I mean, I don't know if there will be something by the end of Q1 like they're advertising. I mean, it's a pretty huge undertaking, but they seem to have a lot of people willing to volunteer, and at least for the time being, they have enough infrastructure to pull this off. When you think about CentOS, how we've been today, I mean, it's actually, if you follow that project, it's a relatively small number of people who have kept CentOS going for the last 5 years, even though they were absorbed by Red Hat. But the actual number of people doing stuff was pretty tiny. So it doesn't take a huge amount of manpower, but it does take devoted people. So I think, yeah, I'm definitely following, probably will volunteer if that's the route that we end up going. But we are sort of in a wait and see moment as well. And if I can, just to respond to another comment I see on chat about, why people might be hesitant towards Stream. And I do think that it is, Stream would be possible, but it does take a change in our mentality, I think, from an HPC community point of view of just being willing to be in the habit to say, yes, I'm going to possibly update things very, very quickly, and that I'm going to have even locally a CI infrastructure by which I can validate everything. And I think that's really where the rub is. The problem, we sort of sit between being distro providers and insights in OpenHPC land. And when I think distro providers often sometimes, they don't appreciate, they know when they push something to their latest version of CentOS or even Stream, they have a very capable CI system behind that by which they're testing all of their components against each other, right? The problem that they don't appreciate, I think, quite as much from our point of view is that the HPC sites, the distro is a relatively small bit of the overall computing environment that we are giving to our users, right? It's a necessary environment. It's a very important environment, but it's not, at the end of the day, we're not really using MPI or compilers a lot of times, or HDF, or all the things that we're used to that our HPC users need. And that's where things go south, is when you rely on one or two things from the distro and they change it, say at a weekly level, that means you're starting to need to be rebuilding and testing on a weekly level, or perhaps a daily level. And I think that's the problem with something like Stream today, is if we were to take it on, we're either going to have to be willing to, take system maintenances much more often, which is problematic in some cases, and we're going to have to, just be willing to push things and test things much more often than we are today. And that's why I think it's problematic. But that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. One of the questions, and this is kind of specifically towards Adam and NVIDIA, is since kernel hardware support is such a big part of the Red Hat CentOS, and a lot of the hardware drivers for HPC are interested from NVIDIA. Does NVIDIA certify all long-term support versions of Ubuntu for InfiniBand and GPU?
So that's a really good question, and I'm actually taking a look at that right now just to make sure that I have the right answer for you. From an InfiniBand perspective, it does look like we're currently providing drivers for the Ubuntu LTS releases from 14 up through 20. And so I would expect all of those to work. GPUs, I'll double check this. I think that's a narrower window, but I think that at least from Ubuntu 16, 18, and 20, I believe are all supported. And we try to stick with support at the very least for any LTS distributions that are also supported by the distribution provider. So for example, at the point at which, this is not, I'm not trying to make any forward-looking statements here because I don't set any of that, but like at the point at which, for example, Red Hat stopped supporting Red Hat 8 would probably not support it either, because if distro provider isn't supporting it, then it's going to be much harder for us to support it, adding software to it. But if it's a distribution that we support in a long-term support fashion, and the Linux distro itself is under support, then you should expect us to as well.
All right, thanks. One of the other questions in the chat has been, has anyone used Scientific Linux in the not so distant past? And what are people's thoughts on the possible revival of Scientific Linux? Troy?
We had used Scientific for a while at Nix, and we moved off of it when it was not really discontinued, but when it became clear that they were going to be cycling back. And that's when we moved to CentOS for our Red Hat based systems.
Adam, is there any Scientific Linux experience at NVIDIA?
So I can't speak to Scientific Linux at NVIDIA. It's not something that I've personally used. And I mostly haven't been here during the days that Scientific Linux was a big deal. In the past, when I've definitely used Scientific Linux, and I remember I used it quite a bit right around like the SL6 days. But again, in most settings that I've seen around the time that like CentOS, I remember, I seem to recall that like right around the CentOS 6, Scientific Linux 6 timeframe, CentOS was a bit delayed, and Scientific Linux actually managed to release earlier than CentOS, which is part of why I think it saw a fair amount of uptake at that time. But since CentOS was under more consistent support, and especially as Fermilab started rolling back Scientific Linux, most of the platforms I'm familiar with moved to CentOS.
Thanks. And Karl, any experience with Scientific Linux?
Only as a consumer in the SL7 days. I have not seen it really come up in too much in the discussion as a potential replacement. So it's not exactly on our radar. But I unrelated Scientific Linux, I think Adam made a good point about whatever we end up choosing as sort of a CentOS replacement. I mean, an important issue is sort of the lag time between, whatever it is versus RHEL upstream. And, that's one thing where we saw some improvement recently on the CentOS side. I mean, if you remember when RHEL 7 to CentOS 7, I mean, there was a big lag for that first CentOS 7 drop that was pretty painful for a number of us. The CentOS 8 was not nearly as dramatic, and then once it was out, 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, I mean, had been relatively on track and pretty quick compared to RHEL. So I think that's one thing we also have to keep in mind for making long-term decisions. Is it seems like there's going to be multiple options. A number have been mentioned here today that I think there will be enough interest in people putting out an initial RHEL sort of equivalent. But what I don't know is, how committed they will be to long-term development of that and how fast they can turn these around, because that will be important, and it impacts things that were mentioned. I mean, I think the stuff around the file systems, Lustre, BGFS, kernel module things, the interconnects, which were mentioned as well. I mean, I think those are things that we all rely on that we don't have a huge impact on, that we're going to kind of have to wait and see what the vendors end up choosing, and if we think about the landscape that we've been at, it's not like Lustre was always ready on day one, even when the next version of CentOS came out. I mean, that has always, just something like Lustre has been a big headache for us. And, moving to a model where the kernel changes even more frequently is not likely to make it better.
All right, thanks. Stefan Pepperos, you have a question?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to add something here, which I believe is relevant on the scientific Linux topic. I mean, as somebody who has worked at CERN and Fermilab for extended periods, I wanted to add a detail which probably is not known by all of you who tried it. Scientific Linux was supported by a total of 2 full-time employees, one at CERN, one at Fermilab, basically. I'm just giving this as to give you a perspective how much effort it takes to maintain a downstream Red Hat derivative. And I'm pretty sure they would have kept going if CentOS did not provide the same thing for absolutely free. So in my view, going back to a similar model is very, very much doable. That's just what I wanted to add here.
Yeah, I have heard, I don't know for sure, but the sort of the order of manpower for CentOS 8 or CentOS has been something like order of 5 people. So a little bit more than that, but in the same realm of mentioning that it is not, it's not a gigantic team if it's really just a rebuild. What's important is the infrastructure and the access to build and test resources.
Yeah, and that was a bit of a problem before the CentOS team got absorbed by Red Hat prior to 2014 as well. We would see, packages not get pushed downstream to CentOS for, sometimes weeks at a time. And that really improved after, Red Hat kind of threw some infrastructure and resources towards that original CentOS team that joined Red Hat. So it's not a trivial matter to create a downstream OS. With that, does anyone else have any questions? I'm trying to read through chat. Feel free to unmute.
One observation I'll make is that if you end up having to have a mix of systems, if you have some SLES and some RHEL, if you have a good configuration management system, you can hide a lot of the problems with that. Not all of them, but some of them. I know when we started having our first SGI-based SLES system at NICS, we had a couple problems where we had some things in our configuration management system that were hard-coded for Red Hat, and they would make the SLES machines not boot, which was fun. We also had a couple things where we'd hard-coded managing IP tables a certain way, and it didn't interact with the SUSE firewall D stuff at all. With more recent configuration management systems, especially if you're using Puppet, if you've seen the provider stuff that a lot of the community modules have now, they can hide a lot of the cross-platform details that were hard to deal with in the past.
Yeah, I see in chat too that before we started moving towards Linux for HPC systems, a lot of these supercomputers came with their own vendor supplied OS. And there's some rumblings that maybe that might become a new trend again, especially with Cray packaging their own version of SUSE, and IBM kind of taking over Red Hat. We could also see a variant for IBM specific hardware. What are folks' thoughts on the possibility of that happening? Adam,
I think that will be met with huge resistance. Yeah, I mean, when you think about, sorry, I jumped in without my turn, but I mean, when you think about, how things improved once we got away from that model, and just how fast Linux completely took over as the dominating operating system on top 500. I don't know. I think we learned a lot from that, and I hope. I've been both on the vendor side and as an end consumer side, and I'm sure it makes things difficult for vendors for sure, but it also allows the community to help take itself and to provide information back to the vendors that they don't have to do. So I don't know. My guess is that may attempt to happen, but that it will be met with a lot of resistance.
All right, thanks, Karl. Adam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would typically agree with Karl. I would say, NVIDIA sort of does a little bit of our own distribution insofar as we distribute DGX OS for our particular DGX systems, but we're pretty open about the fact that OS is effectively, upstream Ubuntu with some extra packages and package repositories layered on. And we'll, provide some guidance about kernel versions that we test on and that kind of thing. But in general, we try to stay as close to upstream as we reasonably can. And we do that for both the Ubuntu and RHEL versions of the distribution that we provide for that particular hardware.
Thanks. So, going back a little bit to Troy's comments about, hiding a lot of, or abstracting a lot of the OS choice through configuration management. How many people here use Ansible for heterogeneous OS environments, and how has that worked out for you?
I'll jump in and mention that's exactly what we do right now. We have an Ansible configuration management system that we use on both our Red Hat based and Ubuntu based systems, and we support both. It works out fairly well in most, Ansible does a fairly good job with a lot of its modules of abstracting between distributions and does the right thing. We do have some special casing where, for example, we need to provide where we need to configure a particular file and it's in different locations on the two distributions. But for a lot of what we do, like package installs and so on, the configuration management system does a pretty good job of abstracting that.
All right, thanks. Troy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I think I kind of said my piece about it before.
Yeah. And Karl?
I just would agree that, I don't have experience using Ansible, but using another configuration management that use attack. I mean, just the point being that I think it is a good idea to abstract that, agree with everybody else. And, from the point of view of the end users, I think it was said on chat as well. I mean, hopefully for the most part, they could care less whether they're on a, CentOS, RHEL, SLES, Ubuntu, whatever, right? I mean, you want to make that as transparent as possible for them. So I think this is mostly, centered around discussion from a system administration point of view. But just because I go back and forth between two distros so much, I do this fairly often where sort of use one configuration management. We use one bare metal provisioner. I'm actually doing something which I don't know if there's a lot of other folks doing as well, but because we do builds against multiple architectures, I have to add that into the mix as well. So, managing from an x86 box, provisioning ARM boxes and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, be curious if people expect to see more of that coming, since we do see some more ARM adoption, it seems like, in the community, but that's another thing to potentially think about.
Yeah, especially as ARM chips are becoming more prevalent, and we're seeing a lot more interest in ARM production in general. It'd be interesting in the next few years how many sites actually, switch their architectures over to ARM, either, partially or completely, especially with the laggard performance that Intel's chips have been showing as of late. So, CentOS and Red Hat have been, great for a lot of uses, but there are some people that have been using SUSE for a while, especially those with Cray machines. Can anyone speak up in support of SUSE over Red Hat, and any advantages that you have seen over using a Red Hat-based distro?
I have done a fair amount of work on SLES machines, but it was usually either because that was what the vendor supported, period, or because honestly, it was more expensive to put Red Hat on the machine than it was to put SLES on the machine. And I was not a huge SLES fan, but it was also partly because it was kind of forced on me. So, take that with a grain of salt.
Right. Karl?
Well, I would say, I think my experience and what I hear back, I'll tell you what I hear sometimes and also my direct experience, but I think a number of folks in the HPC world, when they experience SLES sort of for the first time, it has been recently in the Cray environment. And if they had come from an environment where they were, running just your traditional x86 cluster running CentOS or something, a lot of times they get kind of frustrated. And sometimes that is, that gets associated with SLES, but I think, realistically, it's more the Cray operating environment, which is much more locked down than what we are historically used to when we're kind of rolling up our sleeves and managing everything ourselves on a non-Cray system. So I have heard people really dislike SLES, but I think in the Cray context, sometimes it's more of a comment of the entire ecosystem. So I will just mention that. I try to be very unbiased as much as possible. We do support, some SLES variant in OpenHPC. I grew up on RHEL, so it was somewhat new to me. Initially, it felt kind of weird, but once I got used to it, I feel like they're almost identical. It's just a different package manager. I don't really, SLES has kind of a more advanced, I would say, TUI if you wanted to use it, which I never use, but that's also because I'm old and I'm a command line junkie. So I would say that it does seem to be somewhat nicer when I have used it, but I don't take advantage of it. One thing I have noted over the years is you often get a newer kernel with SLES, like they have tracked the upstream kernels quicker. So I've always had a newer kernel. And if you wanted, I've had some cases where, particularly around containerization, that it had a feature in the kernel that was beneficial to run the SLES kernel. But otherwise, I treat them as being mostly identical. I do think there was a comment about why SLES, I don't know anything about their financials. We have both SUSE and Red Hat are members in OpenHPC. Obviously CentOS has dominated, but I do find it interesting that the SES people sort of have moved more in the direction of what Red Hat did with CentOS. So Leap, I kind of think is a potentially viable option, but I have no feel for is it a long-term option or not, right? But it is, SUSE didn't have a version of CentOS before, and now they do with Leap. And then interestingly enough, just a year down the road, we're losing CentOS. So it's like they're going in opposite directions. So I don't know what to make of that.
All right, thanks, Karl. You make a good point about SUSE in general following kernel releases a lot more tightly than Red Hat has ever done. Adam, can you speak to why, possibly any reasons why NVIDIA chose Ubuntu, whether that was due to the kernel or anything else?
It wasn't due to the kernel. My experience has been that our bias towards Ubuntu, especially on DGX, has mostly been that we were doing a lot of work with data science folks, and that was the stack that they were most familiar with and most comfortable with, and especially if they had connections to like the larger tech industry, it was in use on a lot of cloud platforms at that time, so it made it very easy to be portable. I believe that Ubuntu was also a bit friendlier. I think this has changed a bit in recent days, but I think that it's historically been a bit friendlier to running containers easily. And that was a direction that we've gone in very heavily so that we can distribute a number of applications and software stacks. So I think that it just represented a pretty good platform to use as our kind of like starting point in our default. We definitely support Red Hat and to a lesser extent a bunch of other distributions, but yeah, I'd say Ubuntu was mostly because the data science stack fit very nicely there.
Thanks, Adam. So, you know, I hear a lot of at least comments in the chat that, you know, a lot of people are waiting for some of the big either sites such as, you know, Fermilab and CERN. A lot of people are also waiting for vendors to see, you know, what they're willing to support. So like Bright Computing is a big example of, you know, them looking at, you know, what they're going to do with CentOS 8 Stream as well. But then there's also a lot of the ISVs, you know, Ansys, Kitware, you know, that I'm sure everyone's going to be tracking to see what operating system they end up supporting. So with that, what are other people's thoughts as far as CentOS Stream? Has anyone tested or played around with it on any of their own boxes or, you know, boxes at their own site? Feel free to unmute.
Well, I would say, I think I mentioned, I have played with it just because we had people report errors in OpenHPC land right away once we released CentOS 8 stuff. So I played with it enough to say, yes, it does break things pretty quickly. It's very easy to enable. I mean, they make that very nice, right? It's just another repository. That part is convenient. You know, and to be fair, if you really are interested in and the one thing in theory that I guess that's adding is, you know, early access to things which would become a future version of RHEL, which, you know, should be, if the regular CentOS wasn't going away, I think we would probably go, oh, well, that's great. It's nice to have access to that. It's just the fact that it's also going away that seems to make things a bit problematic for us.
Thanks, Karl. Any other final comments on that? I know for us at NCAR, we've started deploying CentOS 8 Stream on some infrastructure boxes and haven't seen too many issues yet, but we haven't started deploying it on any kind of compute resource. So.
Yeah, we should mention, I think it came up in chat. I mean, I guess it is conceivable if someone was very careful to just sort of lock down, you know, a version of the repository. Basically, I think you could almost kind of implement what we're used to of sort of an 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, 8.4 scenario, right? You would just have to lock down a local copy of the repository. I think where things just might get possibly dicey is if if they release a security patch that you really do need and it pulls in some other dependencies that break everything, you know, that's where things could break on you. But there's nobody saying nobody's forcing you to take upgrades every day.
All right. I want to thank all the panel members for joining us and providing their input. So thank you, Adam, Karl, and Troy. So with that, I'd like to wrap this up. I want to remind people that next month's presentation is on the Getty's composable platform, produced Kubernetes-based private cloud solution, presented by Eric Go and Brian Wirtz. Thank you, Betsy, for putting that talk together. And I hope to see you all next month for the next call. Thank you all.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.